Casey, I didn't really prepare a bio for you, but I'm super excited. I feel like we'll make a tour through what you've been up to because really, from our conversation, sabbaticals have been kind of a part of your life as you've been figuring everything out along the way. So I think we'll kind of go through. But the thing that I wanted to highlight, the event name is Sabbaticals as Recess. And so the creation of Recess Labs. In my remembrance, that was what really was like your kind of grand achievement in sabbatical land, trying to create an organization for you and your friends and folks in your situation to feel okay about being off. So tell us about that time that kind of led up to the creation of Recess Labs and what you were thinking about when you created it.
Yeah, totally. And so that almost kind of came out of like my second sabbatical. And so maybe I'll start with like the first sabbatical, what came out of that, and then how that led to Recess.
Cool.
But basically, coming out of school, I went to uni as the startup phase. Startup bug was really getting popular in the world. I remember there was a time on campus during like my second or third year at university when Facebook bought Instagram, and all of a sudden all the MBAs on campus started being like, oh, maybe we should do startups and not just investment banking and consulting. So anyway, I tried to do a startup in undergrad and that had failed like miserably. We spent 7 months working on a product that never launched. And just by the time we started doing customer interviews and kind of talking to our users, or we thought would be our users, people weren't interested. And we really kind of we lost the steam to continue on. So I'd kind of been in this phase where I was trying to explore what's next. I finished school and I was interviewing for startup jobs, but just realized that my heart wasn't in it. And everything was just like trying to be on the same success ladder that I'd been on to date. And so I decided to just like go to Central America and see if I could find work like bumming around in hotels and just like to find time to do intrinsically motivated work. And, I think for me and for many people, like being in the traditional startup world or in professional world, there's a lot of focus on extrinsic achievement, whether it's money, status, getting the next step of the ladder, starting a company, these kinds of things. And so originally I was just planning to like spend a year traveling and working on things that I actually enjoyed instead of trying to be successful. But ended up organizing a trip for a number of people and kind of with one of the hotels I was doing some work with. And then that turned into a travel company that I ran for 3 or 4 years. And so what was interesting is like my first attempt at a sabbatical turned into actually a company, and I didn't really get the full sabbatical. And so as I was transitioning on from that company in 2017, I was like, okay, I kind of had meant to give myself this period to really just play, and had gotten a couple months of that before what we were doing turned into a proper business and had to like deal with customers and like making sure we had trips that were financially viable and that kind of thing. And so as I was moving on from that, I had dinner with a couple friends in the city who were also going through this phase, and everyone was just kind of like alone at home in their apartment, kind of like thinking about what they might do next, but also kind of lonely. And like people were saying like, man, fuck, maybe I should get a job. Pardon my French. Like maybe I should get a job just because it's like lonely to be at home and like working on my own thing and not knowing where to go. And so we ended up just in my apartment and living room. We just started meeting and called it Recess Labs, with the idea really being, what does it mean to approach a sabbatical, not from the lens of like, okay, I'm taking time off to try and like further my career and to try and like start a company, or like to really, and some people were thinking about what was next, but to really allow for this kind of free exploration. Because I have this kind of belief that the best opportunities, out there are not the ones you're aware of when you start kind of one of these types of transitions. And it's only through that exploration that they can kind of come there. That was a long-winded answer, but hopefully gives some context.
No, that's great to set the stage. So I want to go back just a bit because I think there's something special about someone's mentality when they choose to, like graduate from college and instead of being pressured by what everyone else is doing, decides to go, live and travel in Central America. So how did you get that idea? How did you get the permission to do that? Because it certainly wasn't on my mind, and I wish it had been.
Yeah. It's for me, I first got into startups like a couple of years before it really like became really a big thing. Because I was at an undergraduate business school and just like had no interest in like I took Econ 101 in high school, enjoyed it, and then ended up, going to school to study business. And like the first day they're talking about like synergy and all this stuff. And I was like, maybe one day I want to start a restaurant. And everyone else is like, how do I get a job at Goldman? So for me at first, startups was this kind of like, I may do something more creative and like exciting and like expressive. But I noticed that like I tried to do a company with some friends, it didn't work. And then I did the startup for almost a year that like I took leave from school and worked on it. And we were trying to do like home decor e-commerce in Japan. This was in the days of like the rocket internet like clone companies. And it was just so clearly a company that was only motivated by wanting to make money and like wanting to like have built a company. And I think I just personally really reacted against that in myself because I was like, and if it had worked, maybe I would be telling a different story. But given that I spent all this time working on something that didn't work and that was something that I had no real intrinsic connection to, I just was kind of like, I mean, it took me maybe 9 months to kind of fully say I'm ready to take some time off instead of like interviewing for jobs or trying to start something else. But that was the kind of the seed that led to that.
And so when you talk about intrinsic motivations, one of the things that we found in our research is that people, are very early on based on their peer group or their orientation towards their family, kind of inspired towards or away from something. Did you know what you wanted to do early on, and you were kind of attacking different ways to get there, or how did that change?
In terms of like, well, I guess I was raised in a family where I was kind of encouraged to explore stuff. Like I was interested in video games growing up, so I went to like a video game summer camp one summer and like learned how to use like how to make simple games on the computer and stuff like that. The real time though, I can like really, there was a sense of like really chasing after what I cared about. First, it was getting really into soccer in freshman year of high school, which was around the time of the like Germany World Cup. And just kind of like it kind of became my life where I was like on two teams and like playing with friends outside of that and playing in between periods and like that. And then and I had dreams to go pro as like a soccer player, which when you start it like in your teens doesn't really happen. So I after a couple of years I realized that wasn't going to happen, and I had this desire to like travel and see a world outside of what I'd known in kind of suburban Jersey. And at that point, found out about like study abroad programs for high schoolers, and ended up going to Japan and spending a year kind of living with host families over there. And had to go through a fair amount of like bureaucratic stuff with school to be able to do that and graduate. I ended up switching school districts. So like, yeah, I don't know if that's exactly what we're talking about, but there've been like a couple times growing up where there was that real sense of like, oh, something feels kind of right, but it's constantly shifted as an adult. Like it's maybe like a multi-year phase, like an arc, and then kind of that phase runs its course. And like recess was one of those phases for me. So
no, I think that's exactly right. Taking a sabbatical is a privilege, that's for sure, and I think it's a financial privilege, but it's also a psychological privilege, right? I mean, there's a lot of folks who have a lot of money who don't feel as though they can afford to take off, or they can deal with the uncertainty around what they'll do next or what people will think of them. And so I think it's interesting to think about how you cultivate that possibility. So if your parents are encouraging you to explore, that probably feeds into it. I know that folks whose parents had taken sabbaticals, kids of academics who got to live abroad super early in life. I mean, I think that just changes the way you think about possibilities and culture and stuff. And there's no better place, in my opinion, to experience a different culture than Japan. I mean, talk about going to a different universe. So getting a dose of that in high school, I imagine, was pretty formative.
Yeah. I will say though, like, basically when I was taking this first sabbatical and like going to Central America before this had turned into a travel company, like my dad still would like every week be like, when are you getting a job? And was like clearly worried. And it was only when like things started to become more solidified. But I think what's what can be hard for a lot of people is, and for, like, even now I'm kind of going through another transition where what I've done in the past is very concrete, and what I'm doing, I'm moving into, is a little less, is a little more open and free form, and is kind of
Yeah.
still emerging. And I think that's like that can be really hard for everyone, when like there are just all these real nice positive consequences around the ego, around money, around kind of how people see you in this like phase of life that maybe has come to a pause, maybe it's kind of come to completion, maybe there just needs to be a break to coming back to it with a new energy. But the kind of new explorations are always going to be less concrete in the beginning, right?
Yeah. I don't know about you, but I mean, the Sabbatical project is definitely one of the most kind of out there things that I've worked on. And even though I knew and know it's going to be difficult in the beginning, like that part doesn't get easier, but the kind of comfort in how, you believe things will turn out, like getting into it is easier, but the first part doesn't feel easier to me.
Yeah. Right. It's like until you start to see some of those connections happen, there's always that doubt, I think, of like, will this actually work?
Okay, sorry. So you're at this place where you and a few of your friends are kind of taking off. Why did you decide to create an organization around it? And did you do that? Were you able to attract other people that weren't inside your friend group, or was it just kind of like putting a label so it seemed kind of prestigious and official?
Yeah. So I mean, the first kind of like batch we did was primarily people, either like people I knew, people who were maybe a couple degrees of separation, like they heard about through someone. But what was interesting is like at the time there really wasn't anything for this, especially for people in tech. At least in New York, there was something in the West Coast called South Park Commons that was starting around the same time, and so we had like people just coming out of the woodwork, and I sent it out to some kind of like email lists and some stuff with friends. But I feel like I I tend to be someone who just sees the potential for community. The travel company we created was a community-based travel company, and I was noticing that I was kind of in this. This is a whole other kind of story, but we were kind of running a co-working space out of my living room at the time, and everyone else in the space was more like traditional, like they were working for a startup or they had something. And I just realized that like the phase I was entering into, it was very free flowing and explorational. So, I might have this like read something and get really inspired at like 2 p.m. on a Thursday, or on Tuesday or something like that. And really want to talk to someone about it, or like to want to get feedback on it. But other people who are working jobs or running startups, like don't really have the flexibility to just like drop what they're doing for half an hour in the middle of the day and have a deep conversation. And so I think a lot of it sprung from both wanting that community around, like people who were in a similar space and had similar ability to just kind of like bounce around ideas and maybe work on stuff together. But also just like hearing from other people who are doing it. And for a lot of the friends I was talking to, I was lucky that I'd had this experience coming out of college where I'd taken the leap and like really serendipitously ended up creating something that, basically was the foundation for the next couple of years of my life. But most people hadn't had that, and this was their first foray into sabbaticals. And so it also felt like something that was helpful for others who were going through the same doubts, but who hadn't yet had some of this like reference experience that, this could actually be like the most impactful move one can make in one's career, even if it's unclear where it'll go.
Yeah. What did you observe people learning? I mean, what did you learn? And partially this sounds like the last time you took a sabbatical, where you're kind of taking a sabbatical, but you kind of turn it into a job. But what were you learning? What were they learning over the process?
Yeah, and I mean that's ultimately why Recess was this kind of like 9-month project that like started and eventually wound down as I kind of found my next feet. But I think some of the things we learned is like, I mean, one thing, just calling it Recess Labs and like having something on LinkedIn that people could say, I'm a fellow at Recess, just gave a lot of people peace of mind and social cover. Like a lot of what people would say early on we were doing was just like giving everyone social cover to like kind of go through this exploratory phase. Cause you know, you have your parents or your friends ask you, what are you up to? And like, yeah, I'm thinking about ideas or I'm exploring what I care about. Like, they're like, great. When's that gonna, you know, let me know when you're ready to kind of become an adult or whatever. But if you say, oh, I'm a fellow at this thing, Reese's Labs, and there's other cool people who are doing it, and like, you know, here's some stuff that might come out of it, and it's like, oh wow, this is a thing. And so I think that like that was a big part of learning, and just how it was crazy. You know, even just like a month or two in, someone had a birthday, and like someone else brought in cake and candles, and like everyone saying, and it was just like it's the kind of stuff that you would have at like an office party, like at an office. But we're able to kind of still have that sense of community as individuals. And I guess the second thing was just that like people generally had the sense that like their mental health just went up significantly by just having that place to go, having people around, and not feeling like you're crazy to just be at home, not, you know, not making an income while exploring what's next. And I guess the last part of that is I think also just a permission that was given for folks to really take care of themselves as a result of being in a community of other people doing this. Like there were people who had savings, but were like, okay, I can't do anything. I've got to cancel my gym membership. I've got to like minimize the amount of money I'm spending no matter what. And we're cutting out things that were actually like pretty important to them, you know, for their mental health and their happiness. And I think that like, you know, we all come into sabbaticals with different financial situations, and it's important to like have to be mindful of your financial situation. And like for me, I tend to never take a sabbatical unless I've got at least like a year worth of savings saved up. But if you have like that kind of saving, I've seen that most people won't be on sabbatical for like more than a year. Like there's something that happens at a year where you're like, okay, I've been doing this for a while, and even if I still have money, I feel like I need some more action. And so I see people kind of like take a sabbatical. They learn some things. Sometimes it turns into a company. Sometimes it turns into a new career. Sometimes, you know, it didn't fully kind of crystallize, and they go back to work for a period, kind of recharged and excited now because they knew that like they took the time to explore their passion, and so that's not always like sitting in the back of their head when they're doing whatever they were doing. And then maybe they come back and explore in like a second sabbatical. But like really, one of the things that can be hard for people is if you're not giving yourself permission to like take care of yourself and to still enjoy life on sabbatical, then it makes it a lot harder to do with enough time and space to like really discover what might be next. Because it's just so much more attractive to be able to like go to the gym and do self-care if you're saying that I have to have a job or something to do.
Yeah. So are you saying that some of the folks didn't like leave their job or went back to the same jobs, or were they on company sponsored sabbaticals, or people just ended up kind of going back even though they'd quit?
It wasn't the most. Some people ended up going back. Like we had someone who, you know, ended up, had worked in media, was thinking about starting a company, explored that a whole bunch over maybe 6 to 12 months, and then decided that actually he really liked media. And so he went back, but he did it. He was able to go back knowing that he was choosing to do that, not that he was scared to do a startup, right?
Yeah.
Like it was an intentional choice, and kind of things similar to that.
Yeah, no, I think about this. There's a really awkward word called counterfactualization that they talk about in the research, but you know, like being able to live out this life that you want to live, at least for a bit. A couple stories that come to mind are a consultant who always thought, you know, if I leave consulting, you know, I'd love to run a eco resort. And so, you know, on his sabbatical, he worked as like a chef in an eco resort, and then got to see all the things that are tough about it and all the insides. And he was like, okay, I'm definitely never doing that. I'm glad that I got a chance to see it.
Yeah.
Or I remember this lawyer who, you know, had a burgeoning practice, and 20 years in, he was like, I've always wanted to be a writer. And I didn't study English in undergrad because my parents wouldn't let me. And so he took months off to try to write a book. And, you know, life for his family was kind of the same. He had 2 kids, and make coffee, walk his kids to school, and then go up and write. And, you know, after 3 months, he basically just put everything in the shredder and came down and was like, okay, you know, I'm not going to be a writer. I actually like the work that I do, and this isn't going to work for me. But
I did that enough.
yeah, he'll never have the regret that he didn't, you know, have the courage to go out and achieve it. So I think that counterfactualization, or whatever we can call it, is super important.
Yeah.
You talked about a year. Do you have any opinions on how long an ideal sabbatical is, or how long yours were, how long you wish they would have been?
Yeah. You know, I found that a year is a good amount of time. I think, you know, if you have less time, that's cool too. I've found that like a mental kind of heuristic I've had for myself is like I always want to have at least 3 months of cash in the bank at the time when I start like looking for a job or really needing something to make money. Because I know for myself, like I don't want to ideally be in a spot where I'm like, I have a month's worth of cash in the bank and I've got to make money materialize in like 20, 30 days or won't be able to pay rent. But I think that like it really depends on what one is kind of really looking for. Like if one just is looking for some time off and to travel, I mean, like I think 3 months can be a really nice amount of time. I've kind of typically opted towards 1 year, but as you've heard, sometimes my sabbaticals get co-opted into projects that are sabbaticals. But you know, it's not like I'm just like backpacking in Thailand. There's typically a fair amount of work involved in my sabbaticals.
On the money front, how have you arrived at those figures, and have you used, you know, budgets, or what have you used as resource wise in order to figure out how long you can last, and put the context of like a dwindling savings account into, you know, the potential increase in money that you get afterwards, or a different direction you take?
Yeah. I think it's been partially circumstance. That's just kind of been at the phase when I've been ready to have a sabbatical. That's like kind of what I've had available to me. And I think that like, you know, I've also seen folks, there's like different ways to relate to money while on a sabbatical. I think like recess was something we offered really freely to the world. And during that year sabbatical, because I'd been so motivated by money for so many years, I was really intentional about like not charging for anything I did, which is a horrible way to start a business coming out of a sabbatical. If that's what your intention is, at some point you have to make the switch. But it was really meaningful for me for a while to just do work that I was like excited to offer to people. Almost it was like more like art than work. You know, we had people at recess who were doing maybe half-time consulting, or maybe doing a day or two a week to kind of like stem the flow of income coming out. And I'm kind of currently doing something like that now as I'm going through my transition, doing some consulting and some stuff, but with like really an emphasis on having, I guess, more space, not taking on more than like one project at a time. And I think that like either of those can work. And I will say that I think, especially if someone's been working for a while, it can be really helpful to take like at least 3 months off and do just nothing, or not have to do anything. So if that's possible with like someone's financial situation, then that's always ideal. And even if it's not, like even if it's just, I mean, how often do we take 2 weeks off, 3 weeks off in our modern work world, like in a row with no, like not having to check email if we don't want to? That even a couple weeks of that can be life changing. So
yeah. Okay, so are there any, so those folks that took the time off for Recess Labs, do you know how long ago was this?
This was in 2017, 2018. Yeah. So it's crazy. It's been 5 years, but yeah.
That was the same time as my sabbatical. Do you get back together with them? Like has there been any sort of cohesiveness of the group?
Yes. I mean, we did a Friendsgiving in December, post-COVID. Pre-COVID, we actually, even though we didn't have like a formal, so we did a batch in my apartment, and then we did a batch with a local New York City accelerator. like tech accelerator. And that was basically the phase where I'm like, I don't want to do this as a business, because at the point where we're trying to create startup returns, it's no longer has some of that same elements of like play and all that. But after that, and up until COVID, we were doing still kind of semi-regular meetups in hotels or like cafes where we'd have just, 5, 10, 15 people gather and co-work every week or two. So, I mean, people still have kind of stayed connected. Some people are working for each other, with each other. A couple companies have gone out and raised money. Yeah.
Awesome. And then, so tell me now, are you back in sabbatical land again? What's the current status?
Yeah, so I've been kind of trying to decide whether I consider what I'm doing right now a sabbatical or whether I'm starting a company. Because I took a couple months off at the end of last year as I kind of wound up maybe 2 to 3 years of like working for a company for a year and then spending like 18 months doing a lot of consulting work. And I'd been exploring, like the kind of intention was, I guess the second half of that sabbatical I took with Recess. The first half was like working on Recess and exploring intrinsic motivation. And the second half was really like allowing Recess to come to completion and to follow my own intrinsic interests, which at the time was like studying psychology of religion and anthropology of religion and kind of what secular communities can learn from religion about creating meaning and belonging. Because a lot of my work had been in community building, and I'd been really working and learning a lot through trial and error for like the 4 or 5 years leading up to that sabbatical. And that sabbatical, that time off, was the first time I was actually able to like read theory about why what we were doing was working or wasn't working. And so that led to like a rabbit hole of just reading research papers, running a couple conferences, and around kind of community and secular meaning making. And even as I kind of then came out of the sabbatical and got a job or started doing consulting, that was still kind of like something that was happening on the side, just continuing that thread that I found during that sabbatical. And, over time, the projects that kind of like that line train of thought has kind of developed into a couple different projects. And so coming out of this last kind of period of work, there's a sense of like, how do these come together? And so, basically, I've got 2 projects I'm working on now that kind of came out of the sabbatical, but so I'm taking time off from like paid work to work on these, but they're kind of things that I'm like working on to create into something as opposed to just taking time off to free explore.
Yeah. How did your time off inform those? I mean, because there's kind of a fine line between someone saying, I thought about the beginning phases of the sabbatical project as essentially like a PhD light, right? You're learning about a whole new area, whether it's like writing or, psychology and sociology behind work and things like that. Do you feel like any of the non-intentional activities towards learning about this brought you to this place?
Towards learning about like the things I'm interested in, or towards learning about sabbaticals, or?
Yeah, towards where you are now, right? So I think that there's activities that I think are intentionally kind of paving the way and preparing someone for doing something different. And then there's activities that seem wholly unrelated, but into people's creativity or like well-being and recovery, which allows you to.
Yeah, totally. So I mean, I think the thread that I'm currently pulling, although it's kind of like now there might be a second thread in here, really started about halfway through the sabbatical. I was on the way to a meditation retreat, and a friend of mine had gone through this course. I think it's called the Creator Course. It was started by a Georgetown professor. Basically, he was taking seniors in college and helping them write a book as their senior project to go deep into an industry and share it. And my friend was kind of working with this guy because he'd opened it up to non-just college students. And she sent me some of the resources they had on deciding what book he wanted to write. And it was questions like, what books do you most recommend to people? Who would you most want to have dinner with? If you could work at any company, what company would you work at? What do your friends make fun of you for? And at the time, I was like spending a lot of time thinking about should I do a startup, all this stuff. But all the answers I had were around kind of community and religion. It's like, I'd want to work for On Being. I'd want to, people make fun of me that I'll start a cult one day or things like that. And so I was like, okay, what if I really just leaned into that? And, started auditing courses at a local seminary and like going deep into that. And, not really knowing where it would lead, whether I'd be like, maybe I'll write a book one day, maybe I'll start some kind of community around this. And just over time, really kind of got really interested in this problem of, the world is increasingly secular and religion is like a social technology that met a lot of needs for a lot of people and still meets needs for a lot of people, but there's a growing swath of people who don't have that need met in the same way. And so what does it mean to try and like create things that can help people meet those needs? And so that is a problem that I never would have gotten to by just like thinking about what should I do with my life. But in kind of like reading and going through these courses, and also like a lot of this helped make sense of some of the experiences I'd had in like spiritual spaces as I was kind of coming of age, things that were helpful and things that were like very unhelpful. That led to kind of like a thread that I continued to pull even after I got a job, and like continued to talk to people in the space, organize some conferences while I was working, and eventually got pointed towards some like a specific church in the Christian world that had launched like 40 nonprofits out of their congregation. And I thought it was just like a really cool organization that I'd never heard of because, I didn't grow up, I'm not Christian. I didn't grow up in the church world. But I was like, man, if there was a secular version of this, I would totally be a part of it. And so that's kind of what we've been trying to create, is like kind of an organization based around like contemplation and around impact, but without any kind of creed or belief system. And like that is there's a very direct thread of like things that I was pulling from the sabbatical to what we have now. That would not have, like, there was no way I could have imagined this even like 2-3 years ago. And I think that's the other thing that I think is important in talking about a sabbatical is like, the work I did on sabbatical is still informing where I am now. And I'm still kind of like, it's still maturing, even as I came back and took a more traditional role in tech, even as I went through other phases, like that kind of kept fermenting and marinating and kept coming across new resources that kept like shaped what we were working on. And now this is like a second sabbatical going deeper into that. So I think a lot of people feel like, oh, if I can't figure out my life in 6 months or a year on the sabbatical, like I've failed in some way, or it's like, it's going to be horrible. And people, I don't think, like to hear this, but like life sometimes has a longer timeline than we'd want. And even if, you can discover something that you're excited about, but it doesn't kind of fully become clear of like what role it plays in your life, or what it looks like as like something, an offering to the world. I think that, over time that can still develop. And I think that like viewing a sabbatical as like a do or die, I have to figure out, my purpose in life can often add pressure that's not necessarily necessary or helpful.
Yeah, no, completely. I have so many things to say to that. I mean, I think that, it's good news for employers too, right? A lot of employers are assuming that everyone who goes and takes sabbatical are going to leave. And I think that long incubation time, I see that a lot, where folks are like, okay, now I've just like put work in the context of life, and so I'm holding on to it less tightly or whatnot. And, as you said, it's marinating and the other ideas are coming up. And, for folks, like, I think about talking to folks who, you made a decision in high school or college, you followed kind of your peers or what the best students in the major went, and you've kind of been making small decisions over the course of your life. But how long have you spent actually being intentional about what you want to do and who you are and exploring that? And so to come up with that in a few months after, decades of kind of just like putting your head down and doing something is pretty unrealistic.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think also like for employers, people, I think that counterfactual is a real thing. It's like, you know, you could have the same employee, but without the story that maybe I could be going and like, you know, making a living as a rock climber on Instagram or what have you. They can just like be, you know, in the work you're paying them for. And like, also nothing makes someone appreciate a regular paycheck so much as having a period of like more stability. And so like oftentimes for both sides, it can be really nice to like come back after a period of exploration and like more uncertainty. Then like, oh yeah, you know, remember that like money is important, and to kind of like again be able to choose to be in that role and to take the pros and cons with like having a salary job, but without the what ifs.
Yeah. Do you have, so it sounds like you had a kind of, as you said, a thread you wanted to pull around kind of religion and community. Do you have any recommendations for what folks should do to figure out what that thread is? Sounds like that book, the Creator Course, which I'll look up, was a pretty good one. Do you have recommendations on activities to do or books to read?
Yeah. So that wasn't a book. So he helps people write books, and I don't know if that material is public. I think he might have some stuff on YouTube around it. And I'll say that I found that thread 6 months into my sabbatical. So like,
yeah,
you know, it wasn't there on day one. The best book, my favorite book on sabbaticals for a sabbatical is Fail Fast, Fail Often, which is a book by 2 career counselors from Stanford that is relatively unknown. And it's kind of like in the vibe of designing your life, but before designing your life. And it basically looks at like fear of failure and what does it mean to, and it has a lot of really, I think, useful stories of people chasing what interests them and stumbling into something important or something meaningful. So that is my kind of like biggest recommendation. I'm also a big fan of like Parker Palmer, The Courage to Teach, which is a book for teachers on finding vocation, but is applicable to kind of anyone that either has a job that they feel is a calling of the heart or is kind of looking for a job that's calling of the heart. And then David White's Crossing the Unknown Sea, Work as a Pilgrimage of Identity is also one of my favorite books that I read during that sabbatical. But all in all, I think like the high level is just like learning how to pay attention to when you're doing something because you actually are enjoying it.
Yeah.
Versus for some future success or because there's some kind of should. I guess Drive is one last book I'll just offer, which is all about like intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. One of Daniel Pink's earlier books. Yeah.
So during that time, so you mentioned it took 6 months to figure out which string to pull. What kind of stuff were you doing? And I think one, and I don't know if this was your case, but I assume it was, but one misconception people have is that, you know, being off is just easy and fun all the time. You know, there's no pivots and things. So what were some of the experiences that you had during that time?
Yeah, so I went, so one was like starting recess and like beginning to bring people around me who were also going through this period. I took 3 months and went to Japan, 2.5 months. And the first month I had 2 friends with me. And then the last 6 weeks I was kind of on my own. But just traveling with friends was really wonderful. And like, I remember part of what, like, I think I discovered Parker Palmer through reading a brain pickings post on my phone randomly in some cafe in Japan when I was traveling with friends, when I like should have been thinking of startup ideas to do next. It's kind of like the framing I was bringing to that time.
Yeah.
And, you know, and the job I ended up taking after that, at the end of that sabbatical, was someone who I met in Japan during that time, like a friend of one of the people I was traveling with. And then I came back and I was doing stuff around Recess, this community, and I was spending a lot of time trying to think up like what company I would want to start next. I was like really interested in healthcare and basically like why some doctors and like other helping professionals are like significantly better than their peers and why some are mediocre and some are just utterly unhelpful. But a lot of it for me was like trying to process, or was like trying to look at pain or things in my own life and see how that might be helpful. Might be something that a company could start around. And then doing a decent amount of improv in the city and just kind of like trying to, just stay grounded. And I guess also I went on like 3 or 4 meditation retreats during that year. It was also pretty kind of meaningful for that kind of shift.
Had you done improv before, or was that your first foray?
I'd started doing it when I first moved to the city in 2016, so maybe like a year and a half earlier. And for me, like that was one other way to try and stay connected to community. Because I think one of the things you lose when you don't have a job is community, the community that comes with like having a place to go every day and having people around you. And so even though we were doing stuff around that with recess, it was also important for me to like have people I knew through improv to like go to dinners if people invited me to things, to continue to like train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and do other kind of activities that allowed me to be in contact with people.
Yeah. Cool. So like if someone's coming to you to ask about taking a sabbatical, what do you say? What are best practices? What are things to avoid?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think in addition to the stuff we've talked about so far, like I usually recommend like 3 or 4 of those books I said earlier. I might, I think like there's something about traveling for a period that can be really helpful to just kind of get out of one's day to day, finding ways to be in community and continue self-care. I also really like this thing I got from the folks at Open Masters, which was a community that was around for a while around doing self-directed, self-declared master's degrees, like kind of self-directed continuing education. And what they advised their students was to pick a date in the future, at least 3 months in the future. And that's the date that you will not decide before then what specifically you're going to focus on or what you're going to do next. And I think really having that permission to not have to figure out in a month what I'm going to do is really important. Because I think people are just so burnt out often when they come to a sabbatical. That it really is important. Like the choices you make in the first days and weeks of having a little bit more space in your life are different than the choices you'll make after having a little bit more of a return to baseline in terms of like neurosystem activation.
Yeah. No, totally. I think it's kind of like I think of it as a starving person in the desert, or like a hungry person in a grocery store. You're gonna make bad decisions, and you can't possibly know what mind frame you'll be in when you're in a healthier place until you get to that place.
Yeah, totally.
Cool. Any parting thoughts?
No, I think the only thing is just like it's all this being said, it probably will still feel scary at times, and that's okay. Like you will probably worry about running out of money. You'll probably worry about like whether or not you're taking your life off course, and like that's part and parcel of it, and does not mean just because it sometimes feels painful or their doubts and worries come up, it doesn't mean that it's bad or wrong. And those often are like part of what comes up on the path to what you really care about.
Yeah. Do you have like another sabbatical plan? Do you have an idea of how often you'll take these breaks, or is it just come as it may?
So I'm not sure yet. It will depend on like how these projects I'm working on now pan out. I'm kind of in the process of building this coaching company and then kind of like cultivating this project around secular spiritual community. And the goal is to create companies that I can take a sabbatical from every kind of 3 or 4 years, or to take like a month off a year or something like that. I think that's probably several years away of getting to that kind of point. But I like Stefan Sagmeister talking about like every 7 years taking a year off. I think that's a good heuristic, good goal. But
Awesome. Cool. Well, Casey, good reconnecting, and I have a lot to learn from you on the community created recess labs. It's quite cool. So definitely needs to happen everywhere.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, our stuff has been kind of dormant, but hopefully that's something y'all can kind of bring to life with the work you're doing.
Cool. San Francisco 2022, 2023.
I like it.
All right.
Cool, man.
Good chatting.
Take care.